Okay, what we're going to be doing today is creating a dominant foreground with a subordinate background or a blurred background and learning about layer masks. Alright, so what we need to do in order to make this foreground of the guy blowing bubbles on this interesting bike is apply a filter to the background, an actual blur filter to the background so that this questionable woman in the background is blurred out and our foreground stands out nicely. So the first thing we need to do is create a selection out of this guy on his bike in order to protect him from the blur filter. So instead of using the lasso tool and doing a very time-consuming selection, we're going to do what's called a layer mask. Right now we are in what's called standard editing mode. So here is the icon for standard editing mode. We want to switch to quick mask mode. So we'll click on this icon right next door. It looks like a gray background with a white circle in it. It's actually called Edit in Quick Mask Mode. Click on that. And we want our colors in here, our color swatch here, to be the default. Black foreground, white background. We're going to get our paintbrush tool and choose a somewhat large diameter of a brush. I'm going to start out with a, hard round 19, and I'm going to bump up the diameter to about 65. Alright, so that's a pretty nice size. And what I'm going to do is start actually painting a mask onto my guy here. What I'm doing is I'm not changing him in any way. Just like a mask hides your identity, this mask is just going to hide this guy for a while, and it's going to protect him from any changes we make later on, for instance applying a blur filter. Alright, so I'm going to do my best to make a mask cover everywhere on the picture that I want to be protected from the blur filter. So I'm going to include the guy, I'm going to include his bike, I'm also going to include the cast shadow below his bike. Alright, and notice that I'm going out of the lines because I'm going pretty fast. You're going to need to go a little bit slower so you can make a really nice selection. Alright, and if you go out of the lines, don't worry about it because in a second I'm going to show you what you can do. Okay, so block in pretty much the major area that you want protected. Don't forget the umbrella up here that's attached to his bike. Okay, and you'll have to go and probably change the diameter of your brush several times. Get maybe a smaller brush that you can go around the wheel and the spokes, alright, because you don't want those to be blurred out once we apply the blur filter. So notice that I have definitely gone outside of the lines. So how do you fix this? You can actually invert your colors over here in your color swatch. So click on the little arrow, and notice now that white is my foreground color, I'm going to be it's seemingly painting with white. What happens is that when you paint a layer mask with white, what you're doing is erasing the mask. So you can go in with a smaller diameter brush and erase those areas that you don't want protected, that should be blurred out later on when we go to the filter. Alright, so you will take some time to do this. Alright, for the sake of time, I'm going to go back in my histories palette to the opening, and I'm actually going to load a selection. I already made a nice mask of this guy a long time ago, so I will go to select, load selection, and find my selection, which was called Alpha 1 in the channel box. I'll hit OK, and notice that this is the selection I made earlier. If I switch to quick mask mode, you'll see that this is how I made it. So here is the mask, completely refined, nice mask around the bike, the spokes, this little plate of drinks he has, and definitely the bubbles and the umbrella. Alright, so once you have completed your mask, go back to standard editing mode and see that your selection has been made, your marching ants are showing. Alright, now we're ready to go to our lens blur or blur filter. So go ahead and duplicate the background, right click on the background layer, click on duplicate layer, and let's rename this blur. Click OK. And now what we need to do is apply a layer mask. So go to the bottom of your layers palette and click on the icon for add layer mask. So it's an additional layers mask. Notice that you have in your layers palette now two thumbnail images. You have the thumbnail image of the photograph, which is linked to a thumbnail image of the mask. So it looks like a black silhouette of the guy on his bike. Now, make sure that the guy on the bike has the little borders around him, which says that this thumbnail is highlighted. If you click on the photograph, then the borders will be around the photograph. We want the actual layer mask highlighted, so make sure it's clicked on. Okay, when we apply the blur filter, it's going to make all of the background blurry, and it's probably going to make it look like our guy on the bike is floating in the atmosphere. We don't want that. So we want to create somewhat of a grounding effect. We're going to do that by applying a gradient. So click on your gradient tool. Go up here to your gradient menu and make sure your gradient is on foreground to transparent. Right? Over here in your gradient selections, we have regular gradient, radial gradient, map gradient, reflectant gradient, and diamond gradient. We want the reflected gradient. Put your mode on multiply, your opacity on 100%, leave the reverse box unchecked, check dither, and check transparency. And also make sure that your colors are on black foreground, white background. Now we're going to go ahead and apply a gradient to the bottom half of the photograph. So I'm going to start over here at the bottom of the wheel. I'm going to click, I'm going to drag up. I'm going to release this at the top of the wheel. Notice that it looks like nothing happened. But if you look over here in your layers palette, something did happen. The layer does show up, the gradient does show up right here in the thumbnail image of your layer mask. That's what we want. Okay, now click on the thumbnail image of the photograph in that same layer. Okay, so that's the one you want to click on. Make sure the borders are around it. That means it's highlighted. That means we want to apply now our lens blur filter to this photograph background. So let's go up here to filter, blur, lens blur. Alright, and this is going to emulate or copy the blurring of what a photograph, a normal camera, would actually do if we put it on the proper settings. So we get our lens blur dialog box here. And it's going to take a minute to load. And mine has already been set on the radius 47. And so notice that it blurred out the background and the layer mask protected the guy in the foreground. Make sure when you do this that your depth map is set at layer mask. If it's set at something else, for instance none, notice what happens. Your guy in the foreground will be blurred out. So make sure depth map is set to layer mask. So it protects the layer mask, it protects the guy. You can change around your radius to give you more blur or less blur. Everything else should be set at 0 except for threshold all the way up to 255. You can apply a little bit of noise if you want to give it some speckling so that's not so blurry and it's not so smooth. Alright, and make sure that monochromatic and uniform is clicked or checked so that the entire blur is uniform. Once you've done that, hit OK. Alright, and here's our blur. So now that kind of offensive woman in the background is blurred out and the bubbles stand out nicely. There's one more thing we're going to do to make the foreground stand out nicely. We're going to darken the foreground so that we're going to darken the background so that the foreground stands out. We're going to go to Image, Adjustments, Levels. And now over here we see that there is a map, pretty much a graph, of the really dark tones, middle tones, and light tones in our photograph. Notice that here is the actual value map too. We have our dark, middle, and light tones. We want to get rid of the light tones from the background. So I'm going to pull on this little bar and notice how the background in my preview is getting a little bit darker. And the darker it gets, the more the foreground stands out. And that's what we want. Hit OK, and our photograph is complete.